Energy Policy Watch goes behind the scenes of energy policy in progress. Join Jack Belcher, a principal for advisory services at noted government affairs consultancy Cornerstone, for thoughtful bipartisan discussions with policymakers, elected representatives, and subject matter experts as he examines the regulatory environment, proposed regulations, and rulemaking at every stage in this exclusive Heart Energy video series.
Welcome to Energy Policy Watch. I'm Jack Belcher. Today we're going to have an insightful discussion about what happened during the recent deep freeze in Texas and the resulting blackouts. And we're going to talk about what needs to be done in order to ensure it doesn't happen again. We're joined today by John Harpole, founder and owner of Mercator Energy, a natural gas broker for producers and end user customers. John began his career in the late 80s sourcing gas for General Electric. He's an expert on all aspects of the natural gas value chain and natural gas and power markets, and he likes to share his wisdom on topics like what we're discussing today. I once had John as a witness before a House subcommittee when I worked on Capitol Hill. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for having me today.
Well, Energy Policy Watch is a partnership between Heart Energy and Cornerstone Government Affairs. We interview public figures and energy policy experts about important issues impacting the oil and gas industry. Certainly, an important issue today is the deep freeze and blackout in Texas and the aftermath in terms of public policy proposals. Well, John, you've been warning folks for a long time about what you've described as an impending train wreck. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw coming and why?
Jack, as you mentioned, I've been involved in supplying natural gas to industrial plants since 1986. And we manage at Mercator Energy, we manage natural gas transportation for both producers and industrial end users. And we try to ensure that gas shows up when it's supposed to. And I lived through the deregulation of natural gas during the General Electric days in the late 80s, where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission opened up access to pipelines so that GE could transport its own natural gas. And as we saw the deregulation unfold on electricity and the effort to integrate the electric grid really with the natural gas grid, I saw a number of issues that I was concerned about. Most recently, those concerns were lived out in that Texas rolling or in some areas permanent blackouts back in February.
Well, there have been a lot of terms that have been out there, and for folks that aren't expert on the electricity markets, we could probably use a little bit of clarity. Can you explain the differences between capacity markets and energy-only markets and the role that the reserve margin plays?
You bet. So energy markets, the only independent system operator or system transmission operator, the only operator that operates a energy-only market is really the state of Texas, or more specifically, the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT. They chose many, many years ago to follow this method. I think it was really when Rick Perry was governor. In comparison to the other independent system operators that operate a capacity market. And in essence, Texas assumed that there would be so much demand for electricity that they'd have a cushion or have more than they ever needed for electric generation from nuclear plants, from coal plants, from wind energy, from renewable energy, and from natural gas. They thought that they would have 120% on any given day of what they might need for electricity demand. Now, in the market that I live in Colorado, they measure our market by capacity. And so they look at how much can one generation resource contribute to the total amount of demand on any given peak day or any average day. And so, technically the definition of capacity factor is how much can that one generation resource actually produce versus its potential production. And so let's take wind energy as an example. If if in our capacity market of Colorado, if the utility wants at least 10% of the power coming from wind energy, they know that wind energy has a capacity factor of only 10%. So if you want 10% of the power, you need 10 times that volume. So you need 100 megawatts if you're going to count on wind to show up with 10 megawatts on any given day. But that's not the case in Texas. Texas, as an energy-only market, assumes that there will be so much generation resource out there when they need it, that just by providing access to that market, which ERCOT allows for all the different types of generators, just by providing access to that market, they will in fact always have enough energy for their energy-only market.
So how did the different types of generators perform during the cold weather?
There's a deeper question in that, and is, how did the electric generation providers change in terms of their capability to provide electricity? How do they perform on the day of? During the critical time period of February 8th through the 16th, wind energy was down 93%. There's a lot of finger pointing right now. What I always like to say is that all the different generation resources performed as expected. Natural gas, in contrast to wind, was up 450% during, again, that time period, February 8th through the 16th, and coal was up 47%. And I think the critical thing for the viewer to understand is that capacity factor relates directly to what's critical on the peak day of demand. ERCOT had never seen a peak day in the winter before. And natural gas provides not only fuel for electric generation, but more importantly, home heating needs. And it was that crunch that had never occurred before in a winter time period that unfortunately the legislators and the regulators didn't have the imagination to anticipate that sort of thing might happen. You might have a deep, long cold spell. Although I must say, it's not something that is a 1 in 100 year event, because something very similar happened in February of 2010.
Well, what do you mean when you say that renewable energy landed on a soft pillow?
So over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, there's clearly been an effort to promote renewable energy in Texas. And in an energy-only market that doesn't measure capacity factor, which is a huge positive attribute of coal, natural gas, and nuclear. In an energy-only market, you're not penalized if you don't show up. In Colorado, if you count on 10% of your supply coming in from wind energy, you overbuild it by a factor of 10. And I say that wind has landed on a soft pillow, and that relates to a number of different issues, but most importantly, the production tax credit and all the tax advantages that have been granted wind over the last 10 to 15 years, and will still go on for about 5 years. Jack, there's been $36 billion of tax incentives granted to wind in order to ensure that wind had access to the population centers in Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio. Texas essentially imputed a fee on all ratepayers for the next 10 years, for the last few years and next 10 years, of approximately $5 to $10 a month. And that was to pay for an $8 billion transmission grid that would move wind energy to the population centers. And yet, despite all that investment, despite about $66 billion of total investment in wind energy and $36 billion of tax incentives, there's no expectation for them to show up. And the expectation for them to show up on a peak day is less than double digits, is about 9% anticipated power contribution during a peak day. So yes, I'd say they landed on a very soft pillow and with no expectation of performance when you need them the most.
Okay. So you talked about how natural gas generation and coal generation went up significantly during the deep freeze, but it still wasn't enough to support the needs of the demand in the state of Texas. But I think there were other factors involved too. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened to natural gas production during the deep freeze?
Well, that is kind of the heart of the message that I like to carry forward today, is that there were some critical fundamental flaws in the design of the transmission grid and how it responds. And one of those, and it's really quite sad when you consider the amount of damages inflicted on the state of Texas by the lack of performance by the generation stack. And by stack, I mean by all of the generators out there. But the fundamental flaw, I think, that's critical, and another second fundamental flaw that's not been considered, is that when ERCOT was forced to cut off demand, what they call shed load, ERCOT cut off supply to critical natural gas infrastructure. And I think this is really one of the things that I've been worried about over the last 10 years, is that as we march on into this world that certain politicians would like to think that we'll never burn anything anytime anymore and rely exclusively on renewable energy, they forget that the dispatchable ability, the ability to turn on and turn off for natural gas, for coal, and to a lesser extent nuclear, when much needed, is critical. And so it's, in essence, electricity supply was cut off to natural gas infrastructure, when natural gas infrastructure, natural gas, the commodity itself, could have answered a lot of the issues related to a shortage of electric generation. We've seen over the last 15 years a move to electrify a number of things in our natural gas production, from wellhead to burner tip. When I mean wellhead to burner tip, a natural gas producer may have compression at the wellhead that relies on electricity, and in many instances, that electric compression was put in place of natural gas-fired compression.
And why are they doing that?
Well, in large part, in the EPA has put pressure on natural gas producers to reduce methane emissions. They put out a big report. It wasn't a mandate, but a report in 2016 as an example, saying we need to reduce methane emissions, so let's go to electric compression, or what the field guys call pull power. And Christy Craddock, the railroad commissioner, estimated that 50% of the electricity, 50% of the compression in Texas was run on electricity. And ERCOT and the local utilities didn't realize that critical infrastructure was needed, and so they cut off electric supply to natural gas compression at the wellhead, to natural gas compression in the field, to natural gas power plants or gas processing plants that clean up the natural gas and make it pipeline quality. Those processing plants are run by electricity. The grid, the management system, within that processing plant is run by electricity. You've got downstream interstate and intrastate pipeline compression that was cut off. And so the very resource that could have solved the problem was not able to, because it had not been designated a critical energy infrastructure piece. That's one of the critical fundamental flaws of the system. But there's another one that popped up also that just really came to my attention as this kind of post-analysis continues on. And it was brought to my attention, and Jack, this is anecdotal, but it makes a lot of sense. So that if you're a producer and let's say one of your top 3 fixed costs every month, because you have so much electric compression, is electricity, this producer sells gas more often than not to a natural gas midstream company right at the wellhead. So the producer has wellhead gathering, and then an imputed cost of electric compression related to moving that gas to a processing plant. So the natural gas producer is a price taker in the sense that midstream company offers them a price that's related to a first of the month price. So they say, okay, guys, 80% of your production is going to get a payment related to a calculated index that's calculated and published the first day of the month, and then you get 80% of your gas price will be related to that. 20% of your gas price will be a daily calculated price. So for example, in the Waha Permian Basin area, the first of the month price was less than $3 for natural gas, and 80% of your gas price is locked in for that time period. Well, when the Texas Public Utility Commission stepped in on that fateful Monday morning, President's Day weekend, and artificially set the electric price at $9,000 a kilowatt hour. They increased the cost of electricity as compared to the first day of the month by a factor of 300 times. And so you have a producer there that's getting a fixed price for that natural gas, not an inflated price for the most part, as dictated by what was going on in the natural gas market. And now they have an electric cost that's 300 times what it was first of the month. My suspicion is that a lot of producers, when the electricity came back on, they continued their force majeure event because they knew it was really what we call a price majeure event, and they go bankrupt trying to produce gas. And so one of the solutions that I'll talk more about towards the end of this discussion is there needs to be a separate rate structure for producers that can look back after the fact and say, no, we are critical energy infrastructure. Number one, please, ERCOT, put us on a list where you don't cut us off in the future. Number two, if we do produce, we don't want to produce and have a disincentive, an economic disincentive to produce at these inflated rates that are meant to kind of clear the market and settle the market. Because in essence, what that does is forces us to say, I can't produce, I'll go bankrupt if I try to produce in this electric pricing.
Well, that's a terrible position to be in.
Well, I can't imagine, because these are producers that are faced and knowing that they're trying to supply natural gas for human needs.
Yep.
But what's their livelihood going to look like if in 5 days they experience 6 years worth of electric charges for 5 days of production? And so again, it's anecdotal. I can't point to any company that did this, but it's a fatal flaw in the organization of the system that really needs to be addressed and has not received that much attention as yet.
Well, we're hearing a lot of discussion now about storage and natural gas storage in particular. Can you compare the cost of storing electricity to the cost of storing natural gas?
You bet. So just on a per unit basis, you can store natural gas for about 50 cents an hour. For electricity, it costs about $200 an hour. I think the fatal flaw in this whole analysis of everything's going to turn to the renewable energy world is that people don't realize we don't have utility scale storage for electricity. The largest single utility battery in the world is up in Alaska, supplies about 7 minutes of power for 38% of Fairbanks on a cold day. And so you could, I think the most interesting fact is that you could take from Tesla's new battery factory in Nevada, you could take 500 years of projected production out of that one battery facility, battery manufacturing facility. 500 years of their production would not meet a day's worth of electric demand in the US.
Wow.
So there's just a total disconnect on this. People's misunderstanding that transformer outside of town is somehow the place where they store electricity. Electricity and the electric grid in the US is this finely run mechanism, this machine that's got to balance out so that production matches demand, because you can't store it. So production matches what you're transmitting, matches demand. And the big crisis that happened that Monday morning at 1 a.m. Monday morning on the 15th was that the hertz level, the measure of frequency is the measure of how electricity flows through a system. You want to keep that frequency at 60 hertz, and it dropped below 59. And at one point that morning, had they not shed load, had they not cut off demand in certain areas, it's very possible that you could have lost the grid in Texas for a month, because the voltage that would have surged through the system, had you not been perfectly meeting demand and supply, would have caused fires throughout the infrastructure on the electric grid.
Well, it's a really scary scenario. Well, what do we need to do? What do policymakers need to do in order to avoid another train wreck?
I think they need a kind of a transformational look at this, maybe an intended or unintended push to count on renewable energy for everything. During the years 2006 to 2020, the amount of coal-fired generation that was on the electric grid dropped by 20%. The amount of renewable energy grew by 20%. And so you can't create this disincentive for one generation resource or incentive for another and have a truly competitive marketplace. You've got to level the playing field. But more importantly, I think they really need to take a look at their reserve capacity margin. And until we have some miracle breakthrough on electric storage on a utility scale, they need to increase their reserve margin beyond the 5 to 7%. And so when I say 5 to 7%, they anticipate a certain amount of demand on a peak day. They right now only have 105 to 107% of that potential supply out there. And there are experts that are predicting there could be 2 or 3 rolling blackouts again this summer when peak day of demands increase. They've never seen this peak day of demand in the winter before, but
Right.
I don't believe that the grid issues have functionally been addressed yet. Now, there are several bills pending that have been passed in the Senate Bill 5 down in Texas that are pending in the House and being reviewed in the House. There's another bill that's in the House right now that's calling for better communication. You know, that was first called for 10 years ago during some of the rolling blackouts 10 years ago. But obviously, there's got to be better communication between the electric industry and the gas industry, and you can't shoot yourself in the foot to try to come up with a solution here.
Right. Well, John, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. This has been fascinating. And thank you to our viewers. If you'd like to be a guest on Energy Policy Watch or would like to learn more about our show, log on to energypolicywatch.com. Goodbye.
Thank you, Jack.